Hello and welcome to Conscious Truth, and this is our first video we're going to make. It's about Richard Dawkins and his close buddy Lawrence Krauss. They've been doing a lot of tours around the world and speaking their opinions to large audiences, and I'd just like to make my own commentary on what they have to say. But first, let's listen to straight from the horse's mouth, Lawrence Krauss. He had this to say, which I think sums it up quite aptly.
In fact, that's the thing that I objected the most. I don't mind ignorance so much. It's the illusion of knowledge that upsets me more. And
yes, and that upsets me as well, Lawrence Krauss, because a lot of the things you say, just quite frankly, are nonsense. And even beyond nonsense, they seem to be just outright lies. He goes on to talk about his buddy Brian Schmidt, and listen to what he has to say about how he thinks that apparently there's been a scientifically explained explanation which perfectly explains how the Big Bang and the universe created the entire universe out of nothing. And he tells this huge audience that this has been pretty much proven in the way he sort of phrases it. It's almost as if there's no question to it, that somebody has actually come up with a logical theory which explains how the universe could have come out of nothing. Well, let's listen to what he has to say.
in fact, he has to be held responsible, and I'm happy we're going to Sydney because I plan to hold him responsible for criticizing a book that he clearly hadn't read, and that was a clear example of it. He quoted verbatim from a review by a philosopher of my book, and of course totally bungled it. Totally distorted. But the first part, he said 6 pages before the end of the book, which was how this review in the New York Times began. But the key idea, which really is so difficult and I guess challenging and perhaps threatening to both some philosophers as well as theologians, is this question of something from nothing. As it happens in the case, as I think we've talked about before, in biology. I mean, how do you get life from non-life? That was originally sort of the main theological question. How do you get life from non-life? And even in the original...
Yeah, it's interesting that he brings this up because Richard Dawkins has no explanation of how life came out of nothing. He's convinced that it was some kind of chemical process, even though that has not been proven. And this guy, Lawrence, is convinced that he knows how the universe came out of nothing as well, even though he has no explanation for it.
Version of Darwin's book, he says at the very end, God breathed life into the first species because...
Only in the first edition.
Only in the first edition.
In second edition, he leaves out God. Oh, no, it's the other way around. Sorry.
Yeah, he put it back in because that's right.
In the first edition, there's no mention of God. He says, originally breathed. And then in the second edition and subsequent editions, he says, by the Creator. But that's a much easier problem in a way, because you're starting with chemistry. You start from molecules bumbling around in the warm little pond, as Darwin called it, primeval soup, as people later called it. And then you get the first self-replicating molecule. But something from nothing, from literally nothing, and that's what really gets people. That's the one that's really counter to common sense. And they clearly...
Yes, and hence the reason why for thousands of years people have believed in higher spiritual dimensions, something that obviously Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss have no possible idea of, and to have the mental capacity to be able to understand how there could possibly be anything in a higher dimension or in a spiritual dimension which is beyond their understanding. And they think that basically if they can't understand it, that it doesn't exist.
Misunderstand what you mean by nothing. So
well, exactly, and the problem is I'm often accused of not talking about the nothing that classical philosophers 2,000 years ago or theologians talked about, and the answer is I'm not really interested in their nothing. I'm interested in the real nothing.
Oh.
I'm interested in asking the question, based on our understanding of the universe, we'll probably get back to this often, science changes what we mean by words. And it changes that meaning because we learn about the universe. We actually make progress in science.
Well, if this guy had done his homework, he would have maybe studied the Kabbalah, in which there are actually three types of nothing described. There's the nothingness, there's the infinite light, and there's the infinite negative light. And I mean, in a physical sense, as a physicist, I would have thought he would understand that, you know, before the Big Bang there was no space, so that there was not even space. But he thinks that somebody's come up with a mathematical and scientific model of how you can go from there being no space, no matter, no energy, nothing, to the Big Bang. According to Lawrence Krauss, this has been clearly proven.
Unlike theology. And that's because we can be wrong, and we can learn, and we learn from the universe. So if we ask the question, and I think perhaps the most offensive thing I said, it was initially at the beginning, is that something and nothing are not theological or philosophical quantities, they're physical quantities. Most people recognize that something is a physical quantity, but they...
Sorry, the lack of physical space is not a physical quantity, Lawrence.
They refuse to accept the idea that nothing might be a physical quantity, somehow the absence of something. And so what is remarkable and surprising in some sense how there's been a reaction to it is, in this particular book, what I tried to do was not attack theological notions, but celebrate our changing picture of reality. The amazing discoveries that have been made over the last 50 years, some by people here, by my friend Brian Schmidt here, who won the Nobel Prize for his discovery, that have changed completely our picture of the universe and made it plausible, the most remarkable and unexpected thing you can imagine, that you could start with absolutely nothing. That means, unlike the cardinal said, and unlike some people argue, no particles, but not even empty space. No space whatsoever. And maybe even no laws governing that space. And we can plausibly understand how you could arrive without any miracles, without any need for a creator, without any supernatural creation, you could produce everything we see. And I find that the fact that it's plausible, remarkable.
Well, it is remarkable, Lawrence, that you think that there's a plausible scientific explanation of how that process happened, because, quite frankly, it's ludicrous. It's impossible that anyone, even the idea that someone could even come up with a scientific or mathematical model that would explain that is completely absurd. And you just blatantly don't know what you're talking about, or you're deliberately lying, one or the other. Anyway, let's move on from Lawrence Krauss. It's interesting as well that he also mentioned he mentioned this guy Brian Schmidt in reference to that, who had this to say.
I don't know exactly what the Big Bang was, but I do know...
Yes, you don't know what the Big Bang was, do you, Brian Schmidt? I don't quite know why Lawrence Krauss made a reference to you as if somehow you'd come up with the explanation of how the universe came from nothing. Let's just listen to it again, because it's a little bit confusing. He sort of name drops Brian Schmidt, who's a Nobel Prize winner, as if to say, oh yes, you know, this Nobel Prize winner has come up with this theory, where actually no one has come up with a theory like that. It's just in his fantasy.
An unexpected thing you can imagine, that you could start over be a physical quantity, somehow the absence of something wrong. Actually make progress in science, unlike theology. And that's because we can be wrong, and we can learn, and we learn from the universe. Quantities, they're physical quantities.
Come on then.
Quantities. Somehow the is, in this particular book, what I tried to do was not attack theological notions, but celebrate our changing picture of reality. They space whatsoever, and maybe even no laws governing that space, and we can plausibly understand how you could arrive without any miracles, without any need for a creator.
Oh yeah, you can change
completely our picture of the universe and made accept the idea that nothing version of Darwin's book, he says at the very end, God breathed life into the first species because
little soup, as people later called it.
Can't find it.
I'm interested in asking the question, based on our understanding of the universe, we'll probably get back to this often, science changes what we mean by words. And it changes that meaning because we learn about the universe. We actually make progress in science, unlike theology. And
unlike theology, I don't know. I mean, these guys' entire argument is based on criticizing Christian theology in particular. Everything they reference is to do with Christian theology. How about Kabbalistic theology? Kabbalistic theology has got a very, very complex notion of the nature of nothingness, which for someone who's written an entire book about it, you'd think maybe he would reference that, but no, he just talks about Christian theology.
That's because we can be wrong.
Yes,
and
you're
we can
like
learn,
you.
and
You're
we learn
wrong
from the universe. So if we ask the question, and I think perhaps the most offensive thing I said it was initially at the beginning is that something and nothing are not theological or philosophical quantities. They're physical quantities.
Oh, really?
Most people recognize that something is a
Come
physical
on,
quantity.
name drop Brian Schmidt.
But they refuse to accept the idea that nothing might be a physical quantity, somehow the absence of something. And so what is remarkable and surprising in some sense how there's been a reaction to it is in this particular book what I tried to do was not attack theological notions, but celebrate our changing picture of reality. The amazing discoveries that have been made over the last 50 years, some by people here, by my friend Brian Schmidt here, who won the Nobel Prize for his discovery.
Okay, let's just see what Brian Schmidt knows about the Big Bang again.
I don't know exactly what the Big Bang was, but I...
Okay, and let's just go back. Thank you very much, Lawrence Krauss. And what were you saying, Lawrence?
That have changed completely our picture of the universe and made it plausible, the most remarkable and unexpected thing you can imagine, that you could start with absolutely nothing. That means, unlike the cardinal said, and unlike some people argue, no particles, but not even empty space. No space whatsoever.
Yes.
And maybe even no laws governing that space. And we can plausibly understand how you could arrive without any miracles,
plausibly
without any
understand.
Need for a creator, without any supernatural creation, you could produce everything we see. And I find that the fact that it's plausible, remarkable in this.
So what do you mean it's plausible, Lawrence? What do you mean? Explain. I'd like to hear the explanation of how that's plausible. How is that plausible? Can you explain that? Because you're not explaining it. You're just waffling on, and you're saying things that you think people are going to agree with you, but you're not actually saying anything. Okay, that's Lawrence Krauss anyway. My next video is going to be more about Dawkins, and I'm going to go through his whole lecture with comments on all of the sort of circular arguments, false statements that he makes, and sort of psychological tricks that he does on people to make you agree with him, almost like a hypnotist. I've noticed with these people, him and Richard Dawkins, they both do this common hypnotic technique. It's called the yes set, where you say a lot of things that people will generally agree with, and then you get it, so they sort of subconsciously start agreeing with everything you say. You say things, lots of things that make sense, and then you slip in all your sort of false arguments and circular arguments and false logic in between. They're very interesting, these two, Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss. It's like they have some kind of agenda. They are, and the other thing that's fascinating about them is they're so similar to fundamental Christians, which is who they primarily attack. And they also, all these videos you'll see here on YouTube, they're all, here's one, debate, atheist versus Christian, Richard Dawkins. Islam versus atheism, blah blah blah. It's all extremists against them. It's all it's like they deliberately pick people who have sort of limited mental capacity, and they interview them because then they know they'll win the argument. They deliberately pick sort of people that are sort of intellectually challenged people, Like I saw one interview where he was interviewing this rabbi. The rabbi looked like he was mentally retarded or in sort of some way. He seems to deliberately pick people that they know are more stupid than they are, so that they can win their argument. Anyway, I'll have a lot more to say on Richard Dawkins in the next video because it'll jog my memory. So that's the end of this video. I'm going to make another one. Hope you enjoyed it.